doesn't seem to have stopped after the point where the Soviet Union finally withdrew from Afghanistan. There seem to be ongoing relations between all those different intelligence groups. One thing that followed it, using the same money circles, was the Contragate operation. And many of the people involved in the Contragate operation are high up in the current administration. These were off-the-shelf, covert, secret operations. They were internationally funded. And the bin Laden Construction Company was called in and paid by CIA to build the caves and operation centers that bin Laden operated out of later during the Taliban years. There seem to have been connections and points at which the U.S. could have intervened and captured bin Laden had they wanted to. And there's been a lot in the press, Seymour Hersh and others, that opportunities to take bin Laden were just basically thrown away. I think that we need to get at that history. John Cooley's done an excellent book on Holy Wars on some of it, and Peter Dale Scott, another researcher, has done drugs, oil and war. This is John Cooley's book, subtitle Afghanistan, America and International Terrorism by academics, well-resourced. Drugs, Oil and War by Peter Dale Scott. Compares Afghanistan, Colombia, and Indochina in terms of this deep politics of connection between drugs, oil war, and covert operations. And then Steve Call from the Washington Post did this recent book, Ghost Wars, on the secret history of the CIA in Afghanistan and bin Laden from the Soviet invasion to September 10, 2001. So he takes it right up to the time of the attack. And there's a lot there that really needed to be explored, but the people that were brought forward, at least at the public hearings, to describe what is happening were not very informative. And there are new books out to show that al-Qaeda is more a term, a philosophy, a base idea than an actual organization that functions with one leader, that it's a very diverse bunch of organizations. Sometimes they work together or share resources, sometimes they don't. And we talk about it as if it's one sort of conspiratorial cell, which I think we're accused of looking at the world somehow as in a conspiratorial way, but I think the plots that were handed by the government and the enemies that were handed by the government reflect much more of a conspiracy view of the world than the reality.
I just wanted to add that the funding that flowed into Afghanistan through the Pakistani ISI represented the largest covert operation in the history of this country. Estimates are between $3 and $6 billion. These are acknowledged numbers and testimony before members of Congress and so on.
I think we have just 10.
We started at 5 after, so just we could take one more question. You wanted to follow up, Nick, with the question about the timeline of events in the morning of September 11th?
Well, yes, actually. Yesterday we were presented with really a new timeline of what happened on September 11th with regard to the FAA response and the FAA's alerting of NORAD. Until now, we've had a timeline that essentially was released by NORAD in September 2001 that indicated that the FAA informed NORAD about the ongoing hijackings at these given times. Now we've learned that all these times are supposed to be much later and that this is the explanation for the complete failure of air defense response according to standard operating procedure on that day. And I'd like to ask you, to evaluate this new timeline and what it indicates, especially in regard to the standard operating procedure as it had existed up until September 11th, and also the failure of the Commission to deal with the war games question.
Well, I can handle the first part, and maybe Kyle could take the second about the war games. But we asked in our press release for the event today, was the 9/11 Commission blinded by hindsight? And part of that question relates to the fact that the standard operating procedure has nothing to do with whether it's a hijacking or not. It has nothing to do with whether it's a suicide mission or whether it's a shoot-down question. It has to do with whether any plane has a transponder that goes off for a period of time, fails to communicate with tower, goes off course for a period of time, and this is not just commercial airliners but down to small aircraft, or doesn't communicate with tower. And if that happens for more than a few minutes, there is an operating procedure that involves air traffic contacting FAA Command Headquarters, FAA transmitting that information to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon, and they in turn giving it to NORAD, who have the capability to scramble jets in a very short period of time. Now, they may have had a smaller number of bases from which to scramble it, but the idea that they were posed outward and had no inward capability to respond or no inward radar knowledge is ridiculous. I mean, their own magazines brag about the fact that their radar is so much better than the FAA's radar in many instances that they are contacted when a plane disappears to follow their radar logs and project the trajectory. We have 67 instances in the year before where this standard operating procedure happens at the beginning of an incident. So we're told that this all fell apart because it was an unprecedented incident. It wasn't unprecedented in the first half hour. It might have been unprecedented in some multiple hijackings or multiple failures, you know, all at once, but it's not enough to explain it. We have 3 different timelines now. We have the timeline that we got out of the first FAA NORAD hearing, which was very jumbled, and the staff themselves said that it raised more questions than it answered. We have a timeline that was constructed from public statements through the work of cooperativeresearch.org, and that's sourced, and it's very detailed, and every public source that we could find about a timeline. And now we have, as you say, this new timeline, and it was telling to me yesterday that NORAD basically was, when they were taken to task for not having gotten their timeline straight in the beginning, they thanked the commission for straightening them out and giving them the proper version. As if a witness came in and thanked the attorney for getting the facts straight about what they had seen or heard or when they did what they did. So, I mean, this either reflects the fact that these agencies have no idea what they're internally what they're doing, and they have to rely on an external investigation that they can't themselves do, or there's just an agreed-to version, you know, that's been approached. But the fact is that the FAA notification, whenever it came, is not central, because the military has its own radar. The military has its own defense capability here in Washington. The military was on phone bridges and other types of voice bridges with these agencies from very early on. I mean, the head of the National Military Command Center was on CNN, Winthrop Montague, who relieved, another guy relieved him for duty at 8:30, and he came back at 10:30 that day. But he was quoted saying, "We didn't respond right away because the FAA was tracking 4 seemingly unrelated hijackings." But I asked one of the FAA people that commented yesterday, did they know in real time what was happening with the planes across agency? Was this bridge open to all these different agencies, and Secret Service and FAA, the air traffic controllers, NORAD? And he said yes, that they did.
Would you say they're trying to scapegoat the FAA?
They certainly yesterday put the blame on the FAA and let it sit there. But I think a realistic understanding of the operations. If the FAA and NORAD were so dysfunctional, they would have been fixed long before 9/11, because there have been many air emergencies that they've had to respond to.
One member of the FAA who testified yesterday, I believe it was Ben Sliney, or perhaps it was the other gentleman, Russo, testified that in many, many instances prior to September 11th, the phone bridge worked absolutely fine. They had no problems with it. So there was many technical glitches occurred across the board that day, and there's just been lack of adequate explanation for many of them. I think we're going to have to address the issue of the war games in future press conferences and in our Citizens Watch reports that are upcoming. I'd like to encourage everybody to visit our site, www.911citizenswatch.org. and cooperativeresearch.org for a source of the timeline, and the other sites that have been bringing forward important information about 9/11 that's been ignored. I want to thank again the members of the families, victims, April Gallup, Abraham Scott, and Bruce DeSalle for being here, and for members of the press and for C-SPAN for covering it. Thank you very much.
But they won't tell us who they're talking about. learn such thing. Thank you.
Listen to